sure that you speak clearly to the tip. Hopefully you don't spit on it. Avoid that. That would be great for your fellow coworkers. Don't worry, I'm just treating you. You do make sure they get clean. But that's really important because even if you sit and you even answer like this, it will not work. You need to be actively engaged with the microphone.
Yeah, it should be a good one.
Are there any questions? The last thing is if you're, sorry.
I was just gonna say, can you talk about WebEx too?
Yes, I was just gonna, if you're presenting slides, you need to present them through WebEx still. We are in the process of switching from WebEx to Zoom. We'll have training sessions about how to present public meetings. But for now, to ensure that everyone can see your slides, including our virtual attendees, we want you to present it through WebEx. You do not need to have, present through WebEx. Please do not have your microphone on. Please do not have your camera on. Those are unnecessary steps that the grassroots system will take care of for you. It's really about presenting your visual step. Anything I forget, Diane, Jen, Tori?
Sarah, so these monitors aren't in play with the WebEx?
My guess is that just with the other system issues.
We won't be able to do that. Yeah. I just feel bad that they're going to be like,
Oh, no, there's a screen. right here.
oh,
Yeah.
never mind. Never mind. This is my first rodeo.
What's up with that one?
Okay.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Shannon.
We'll like assign you to the calf wrangle before you have to get in the bowl. That's like what the kids do, right? Like that's the first rodeo.
That's right. At the first rodeo. Well, I feel like I could maybe take on the sheep, the baby sheep.
Oh, the baby sheep.
I'm thinking
I've
maybe.
never gotten on a bull, but I have done the calf wrangle. Won it a couple times as a child in snowmass.
Nice.
Yes, the children chase them, which is silly because the children are not faster. But if you just go across and wait for them to run at you, that is the winning strategy.
That is the way you succeed.
Apparently, I was the only one playing linebacker. I was like,
Well, it's exciting to be in the new room with the new tech.
hand sanitizer.
You talking about sheep wrangling?
Well, no, I'm talking about calf whipping. Like as a kid in the rodeo and snowmass, you
This
have to go in and
conversation's
get the
going
thing first. They put the tags on them and they let them out.
Okay.
I've never done anything with sheep.
I wasn't sure if you were talking the
Mutton busting.
Mutton busting.
I don't know
stuff.
about that.
Mutton busting.
Yeah,
Have you got any experience
I
to share?
I don't know about that.
but I admire anyone who has.
Right.
I just chased some baby cows when I was like 12 or something.
Well, look at that.
The rodeo, I haven't been in years, but it used to have the best food. I used to love. They had like these amazing ribs and the beans were so good. Oh yeah. Oh my God. No, but are you going to quote him tonight?
Good. I'm ready to rumble.
It's hard. It's like when I went bungee jumping.
Oh, cool.
They know how hard it is to delay, and so what they do is they really get up to it.
Oh,
they
Jen's
put you on
voice.
the edge, and they say, "We're going to push you."
Do you remember when?
want to?
I think it was his last tour when his bike broke.
That's
No,
good.
if they don't, you're
Yeah.
just going to sit there, and then everybody else is going to get nervous, and then they're going to bail.
Pulled him by with a trailer full of kids' bikes.
It's a good tactic.
He's like, "Give me a bike, give me a bike." And he got on the kid's
No
bike
way.
and finished the race.
That's awesome.
Right? No, that
Manager for restaurants.
Jen's
That is awesome.
boy, he was
Cancel and
great
reschedule.
announcer.
And you said she's just
I'm fine with that.
Only teasing,
But maybe a little bit.
but maybe a little bit.
10 minutes, I'll second your motion.
I think I remember that. Yeah.
Ward, March 11th, I think, Drive to Survive Season 4, F1 on Netflix. We gonna
Thanks.
compare notes? The fourth season, yeah. 11, March 11th. So I can catch up to what you already know. I have looked at a lot of the rule changes. I have a lot of YouTube videos on tire sizes and wings.
don't close WebEx.
Yeah.
That would be a bad plan.
Yeah.
Are you ready?
Sure.
This is such an interesting conversation.
Live in 5, 4, 3.
Thanks for joining us, you guys. This is the Aspen City Council work session for February 28th, 2022. Apologies for getting started about 20 minutes late here, some technical difficulties, but we think we have some of those ironed out. I think we are only broadcasting currently on WebX. We may not be on Grassroots currently or our Facebook Live page at this time. So I think...
I'm just looking for Amy to confirm for us that the live feed for Grassroots is working right now. Yes.
Okay, we're back?
So all feeds will be working if the Grassroots feed is working. Thank you.
All right.
Very good.
Technically sound. Our work session agenda this evening, we have a Carbon Council goal update, which is the Organics Waste Diversion Ordinance options. We have a Childcare capacity goal update, as well as a Paepcke Transit Hub bid update. And we're going to start with those in order. So we're going to start off with Liz. Hi.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mayor Tory.
Sure, Lizzie.
It's been a while since I've been in this chair. Thank you, Council, for having us tonight. May I share my screen, please?
Yes, please. That's great. And it doesn't have to call me Mary.
Oh, you calling Shirley?
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Council and Mayor, for making time for us today. My name is Liz Chapman. I'm with the Environmental Health and Sustainability Department. I'm a senior environmental health specialist focusing on waste. And with me tonight for the first time before you, Council, is Ainsley Brosnan Smith. She's also a waste specialist with the Environmental Health and Sustainability Department. We are here tonight for two big reasons. We need some direction from Council to decide on which tactics you would like staff to pursue in the pursuit of the goal of reducing our organics going to the landfill in accordance with the Race to Zero that we signed, the commitment we signed. We also need to talk to Council about preferences for funding these additional waste programs and current programs. So those are the main reasons we're here tonight. What tonight's session is going to look like is we're going to start by framing this discussion today in the larger context of long-term planning of waste. We're going to talk about where we've been, where we are, where we're going. Then we're going to have a quick review of the diversion goals that Council set in January of 2022, why we set those goals. Then we're going to talk about the restaurant outreach that we did in November, December, and January to get feedback from the stakeholder group that has the most is going to experience the most impact from changes we make to the solid waste ordinance in relation to organic waste material. That is going to be led by Ainsley, and then she'll kick it back to me to talk about the impact of these tactics that we'll deploy and what sort of tools we have to lessen those impacts. We'll also talk about funding, and finally we'll end the meeting by making sure we understand Council's direction going forward. So where we've been is we started with a waste study in 2015 and 2017 in partnership with Pickens County. That waste study gave us priorities that the consultant said we needed to focus on first to reduce the amount of waste material being buried in the landfill. Where we are today, right here, is our highest priorities. We're going to talk about revising the solid waste ordinance and reducing organic waste. We are continuing our discussions both internally and externally to approach that other priority of construction and demolition waste, but that's not going to be part of today's discussion. We have also started working with our climate action team to revise the climate action plan so that not only are we addressing waste reduction, but we're also talking about prevention and diversion. So that's how tonight's conversation fits into that long-term strategy. So you will continue to hear from us about waste and waste diversion, waste prevention, waste reduction going forward. Why divert organics? And what do we mean by organics? Why have we landed on this as part of our climate goals? So the first thing I want to do tonight is start to change the language that we use to talk about organic material. At the moment, the English language uses the word compost in 3 different contexts. We use compost to mean everything you see on this slide. We say the word compost when we're talking about food, paper, and plant material that can be converted to a soil amendment. We use the word compost to describe the process of taking these raw materials and making it into a soil amendment. And then we use the word compost to describe the thing you buy at the store and put on your garden to grow things. Well, that's kind of confusing to use these for 3 different purposes to use one word. So I am going to try and shift our language so that we're using the word organics when we're talking about the raw material that we're trying to keep out of the landfill. Why do we want to keep it out of the landfill? The main reason and how it relates to our climate goals is greenhouse gas reduction. When we put organic material into the landfill, we create methane gas. Methane gas is 20 to 80 times more powerful at trapping heat in the Earth's atmosphere than carbon dioxide. Therefore, the more we can keep organic material out of the landfill, the fewer greenhouse gas emissions our community is responsible for. Also, our landfill has about 8 years left of life with the new expansion. So the more material we can compost, recycle, reuse, and divert, the longer that landfill is going to serve this community. These are the reasons that Council chose in January of 2022 to set the goals of reducing organics in the landfill by 25% by 2025, and hopefully we will have 0 organic material buried in the landfill by 2050. It's part of our ICLEI Race to Zero commitment. Further, there's a much better use of organic material than being buried in the landfill. You can use organic material, food waste specifically, to feed people, to feed livestock, to create a soil amendment where you can grow food and other vegetation. All of these things combine together to why the city of Aspen is prioritizing diverting organic material. That brings us to the restaurants. The restaurants produce most of the food waste that we generate here in Aspen because their food service, that is what they're serving to the people, that is their business. So we did not want to come back to council with suggestions without first checking in with our restaurant community. I am going to turn this over to Ainsley, and she is going to explain to you who we talked to and what they said to us.
Can I just ask one clarifying question first?
Oh, absolutely.
Sorry.
Always.
I just want to clarify
Yes.
that the goal that we've adopted is 100% by 2050.
That is our goal.
Okay, I thought in the packet I may have read something different, so I just wanted to make sure.
No, that is indeed the goal.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You might be thinking of the larger waste goal is 70% reduction of our entire waste stream by 2050, but in terms of organics, our goal is 100% out of the landfill by 2050.
That's precisely what I was thinking, and thank you for clarifying.
You are very welcome. Thanks for asking.
The other piece of that goal is 25% organics diversion by 2025.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Just to
that's
make
the
sure
other
that
one.
we talk about all 3 pieces of the goal. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, Council and Mayor Tory. As Liz mentioned, my name is Ainsley Brosnan-Smith, and I'm the other Environmental Health and Sustainability Specialist here. I'm going to talk to you about the outreach campaign we did to restaurants. So there's currently 102 restaurants in Aspen that do not divert their organic material from the landfill. So that means all of their food waste is being thrown away. So we were trying to target those 102 restaurants to get their feedback on the challenges they face, the barriers to waste reduction, and how the city might be able to help them accomplish more waste reductive activities. So I'm going to share the 4 points of contact we had with those restaurants. So we first started by personal visits. What that was going into those restaurants and trying to have a discussion with whoever was available at the time. We also had a survey created, we hosted a webinar, and we sent follow-up emails. When we did those personal visits, we had 2 flyers in hand. One had a QR code in English and Spanish linking to our survey, so if they didn't have a second to speak with us, we asked them to please post this flyer anywhere where you can scan it and take our 3-minute survey. And then Liz was hosting a webinar on December 16th. And if you missed it, you can follow that link right on the screen and watch it there, where she hosted a panel of specialists, composting specialists here in Aspen. So we had restaurants that actively compost, talk about what it's like, front of house, back of house operations. We then had the two waste providers, Mountain Waste and Evergreen Zero Waste, discuss the service options for taking your organics from your restaurant and bringing it to the Paepcke County landfill. And then we had the Paepcke County landfill discuss what is the process of churning that organic material into compost. So when we had those personal visits, those are what we handed off to them and let them know about. And then we also mentioned this council session tonight. And then finally, I followed up with emails to all the restaurants we had on file. So we have a running list of contacts at all of the restaurants in Aspen, just to let them know everything I talked about. So how many restaurants were we able to reach? And we had an 86% contact rate. So out of those 102 restaurants that do not separate their organics, we were able to reach 88 restaurants and hand them over a survey, let them know about the webinar, and this council session tonight. Breaking that down a little further, so those in-person visits I mentioned, where we tried to have discussions with restaurants, we had 67 in-person visits out of the 102 restaurants. We then emailed 84 separate restaurants. We had 12 attendees of that webinar, and we had 17 respondents of the survey. As you can see, we weren't able to get all 102. We missed 14 of them, and that has to do with a couple of things. Our outreach started in late November when the city was really starting to slow down, so we did come across some restaurants that had closed doors. They were shut down for a couple weeks, taking a break and preparing for the busy ski and holiday season that was approaching. And then also I mentioned the contact list we had for restaurants. We compiled that during the summer, and we did receive some bounce back emails because the restaurant industry is rapidly developing and there's a lot of new faces that come in, so I did get some bounce back emails from that outdated contact list. Next, I'm going to dive into what we heard when we had those in-person discussions with restaurants. So there was only about 25% of those 67 restaurants had a second to speak with us, sit down, give us their thoughts. The other percentage, we gave everybody the survey and asked them to please fill that out. So I'm going to show you a word cloud. And what a word cloud is, it's a visual representation of the topics and themes we heard from these restaurants when we went in and spoke with them. So the larger the word, the more frequently it came up in discussion regarding organics waste diversion in their establishment. So all across the board, we heard they were interested, which was such a delight to me and Liz. Going into this campaign, Liz and I were experienced in what organics diversion means and how it affects these restaurants. So these other things like smell, space, cost, time, education, that wasn't much of a surprise to us. We know that the entry barriers are there, and those are them. Even though it was 25% of those 67 restaurants we heard from, the most surprising thing we heard was that they were all interested. So that was really great to hear, but we were familiar with all of these other barriers that get in the way of organics diversion. Next, I'm going to share some results from the survey we had. I just need to look at my notes over here. And we asked them two questions. We asked them, what are the barriers? What barriers get in the way of diverting organic matter from the landfill, and why don't you compost? So these are the four most frequented topics that came up. We have space, wildlife, smell, and cost. Liz is going to go into these in more detail about how to overcome these challenges, but I'm just here to present that these are what they were identifying as what gets in the way of organics diversion. And in the last slide, as you saw, they are interested, they want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save space in the local landfill, but there's things like space. I don't know how familiar you all are with the alleyways. I'm pretty familiar with them. We've got lots of trucks going in and out of the alleys. We've got a lot of receptacles as it is, and if someone thinks organics diversion, they're thinking compost, and they're thinking, where am I gonna fit this other receptacle when we have trash and recycling and some compost bins out there already? The other space constraint is in the tight footprint of kitchens themselves, is thinking, where am I going to put this basket on the ground so I can put my organics into it as I'm preparing my food? The other challenge that they highlighted was wildlife. So we do have bears that come and visit Aspen in the summer, and they do get into our trash, waste, and recycling. So the businesses, they do not want their employees themselves, the public, interfering with bears or having any sort of contact with bears, and we want to make sure the community stays safe, and having a nice big bag of organic goodies that bear wants does put up a red flag. We have smell, so it's organic material. It decomposes and it releases an odor. So that's another challenge they identified. And then cost. So cost is related, we think cost is related to when they think of organics diversion, they're thinking of compost. So that's hiring a waste provider for services X amount of times a week to come to the restaurant, pick up the organics, and bring it to the landfill. So those were the top 4 barriers. We heard from them. Yes, Skippy?
On the cost piece, is the only cost they're concerned about the pickup of it, or are there other costs associated that I wouldn't know?
Yeah, Liz will definitely get more into the details about the costs associated with compost, but you are right on the money that it is not just the pickup that interferes. No pun intended. There are a lot of additional costs that interfere. So if you have any questions about the outreach efforts or feedback we receive from restaurants, I'm happy to take those now. But as I mentioned, Liz is going to go into more detail about how to overcome these challenges.
Did you contact the handful of restaurants that are composting to discuss some of the challenges that the ones that aren't face and how they overcame them and learn from their positive experience?
They were welcome to take the survey. They were invited to be part of the webinar, and putting together all the information that we have and why Ainsley says we were not surprised is because over the years we've worked really closely with that 10% of restaurants. So we have a lot of ongoing conversations with them and recognize what their challenges are. Frequently when a restaurant decides to stop composting, they reach out to us directly to say this is why we've ceased our organics diversion program and explain why.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay,
No other questions?
so back to Liz.
All
Thank you.
right, then it comes back to me. So we want to talk in more detail, as Ainsley described, about the impacts of going forward with legally requiring some sort of system for making sure that organics are out of the landfill, increasing the amount of restaurants that are participating in organics diversion. To revisit the slide that Ainsley left us on, we have the challenges of space, wildlife, smell, and cost. We have ways to either address or overcome those challenges, and I'm going to go into each of those in a little bit more detail. There's space problem. There are some space problems that we can solve through rearranging things, but we can't solve all the space problems. Wildlife largely comes down to training people to use containers properly. The smell, there's nothing we can do about organic material decaying, but there are tools and systems you can use to reduce that smell. There are methods that we can use to reduce the smell, and we don't get that many complaints about smell. They're almost all limited to the hot months of July and August, and when we work with those restaurants on using these tools, we have great success in mitigating those odors. And then finally, the cost piece. I'm going to talk about what it will cost businesses and what it will cost the city to move forward with this initiative. Let's dive into the space and talk about what we can and what we can't do. In reference to what Ainsley was talking about, alley space, that is the area that we don't have a lot of control over. What we have in the city of Aspen are a lot of old buildings that are built in a way that we call lot line to lot line. And what that means is they don't have space in their building footprint to store their waste containers. So those waste containers go out in the alley. We have a code that requires new development to make a building such that they can keep their waste inside their building footprint, and that is very slowly eating away at the number of containers out in the alley. But that's a very slow-moving solution. Further, that's not going to be a solution for historical buildings. There are a number of historical buildings that when it comes time for them to be redeveloped, we are not going to let them tear down that wall because our community values the historical integrity of that space, and they're going to continue to need to keep their trash in the alleys. So if we go forward with increasing the number of restaurants that participate in organics diversion through collection through a service, we're going to increase the tightness of those alleys. We are going to increase the number of containers back there. There are some innovative ways to have shared containers. There's frequency of service. There are some things that we can do that perhaps the restaurants haven't thought of, but when they say space in the alley is a concern, they're absolutely right, and that's going to be one of the consequences of moving this initiative forward. On the other hand, as Ainsley described, the interior space of restaurants is unquestionably tight. If anybody's been inside the back of house of any of the restaurants in Aspen, they barely have room to turn around. However, that's a puzzle to be solved. We don't need extra space to create a waste diversion program in those restaurants. What you can see in the picture I have up here is all we did is we took a gray trash can, and we replaced it with a green organics collection can. We didn't require any extra space, and they were able to very quickly and efficiently divert organic materials in that restaurant without increasing the footprint. So we think that as staff, we can help solve the interior space challenges by simply using different containers in a different way than what the restaurant is currently doing.
Okay, quick question on that.
Oh, absolutely.
Just on the alley picture that you have there. Currently, you know, and I mean, obviously the buildings come in and out, maybe there's a stairwell there or whatever, but typically the backs of those buildings are right up to the lot line.
Yes.
So the actual, what you see as paved alleyway there is all City of Aspen property?
By and large, yes, that is true.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that is what we refer to as the right-of-way, the alley space. And as buildings are redeveloped, if they're not historically significant, we require that they get their waste containers into their building footprint as they redevelop that property. But, and in this example specifically, there are a number of buildings that do have some historical relevance, and so they're going to stay built all the way out to the lot line.
Yeah. It's just an interesting relationship. It's not often that the city, I would say, gives right-of-way for usage in this kind of fashion and without some sort of agreement. I guess it's just been historic necessity that.
It's actually a point that I would encourage us at some point to examine further, that there's some kind of exchange and understanding the privileges of using that space to support your private enterprise. You know, Mitch and I had spent a lot of time in these alleys last summer. And another example of something that really bothers this team is the amount of propane, portable propane containers, both full and empty, that get left. Yeah. This is the only town I know of that you can leave empty kegs for days and not have them stolen, because those have a cash value.
Has one.
Well, right, but these are all things that have some kind of cash value that really are affecting the functionality of these spaces to support some of your other goals. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah.
Yes, Skippy?
Well, I was just going to note that in this picture, the alley is not in winter when it's even worse. That's all.
I could not have made that point better, Rachel.
I just want to kind of better understand the problem and our proposed solution. So I would think that the outdoor storage is an issue for a lot of people, that a shared situation could solve most, if not all of those. And so are we saying that we're not going to work on that, or we are? Or I'm not clear on what our plan
I
is.
apologize for not being more clear. We certainly are going to work on it, and we are going to encourage shared waste containers use to reduce the number of containers. However, there's a trade-off with that. We solve one problem and create another. Shared waste containers are one of the biggest reasons that the police and the parks and our department have a problem making sure that people are complying with our wildlife safety portion of our solid waste code. Shared waste containers mean shared accountability. Shared accountability means it's very difficult to track down who's responsible for that container being left open and used improperly. So we're trading one problem by solving another. We're solving the space problem, but now we're creating an enforcement issue.
An opportunity to improve our enforcement protocols.
Indeed. And to Sarah's point, I do want to draw your attention to this alley. You'll notice there's a ladder, there's bikes. People illegally use this space to store materials, which is an ongoing problem downtown. We're trying all kinds of things to work on it. We're going to continue to try things to work on it. But adding more waste containers is going to exacerbate this space issue.
That's clear.
Yeah, and as Rachel said, in the winter, we've added a whole nother level of complexity and hazard to the situation. Any more questions about space? Okay, moving on to wildlife safety. I care about bears, You care about bears. I dare say everyone that visits or lives in this community cares about bears. And bears sure do like our trash. What you see here is an example of what we don't want and what we do want. What we don't want is what you see in the horizontal picture with the bear making a meal out of the contents of a plastic waste container. What we do want is what you see in the vertical picture on the right with a closed, all-metal, recessed lid compost container. If everyone were to close their compost containers properly, or their organic collection containers properly, then bears will give up on that. Bears don't keep coming back to places they don't get fed. These containers are quite effective at keeping bears out. It's a simple device for a human to use. It's quite challenging for a bear. They don't have the opposable thumbs. However, as you can see in the horizontal picture, we've got a plastic container. No matter what kind of latching mechanism you have on a plastic container, if the material inside is enticing enough, AKA concentrated food material, the bear is going to be able to access the contents of a plastic container, which is why our partners at Paepcke County provide what you see on the right, those all-metal recessed lid containers at no charge to any of the retail food services, HOAs, or other commercial entities that want to participate in organics diversion. They can have use of these all-metal bear-proof containers at no charge. However, as our partners at the police department will attest, people do not always close that lock. It looks really simple. It is really simple. It doesn't get done. We're talking about containers that are being used by people at 2 o'clock in the morning. They're in a hurry. They aren't going to get the ticket if there is a ticket written. They aren't going to encounter the bear. It's very difficult for us to keep up with the 10% of restaurants that are currently engaged in organics diversion. Our staff, and we've got a whole task force that is made up of Aspen Police Department, the Parks Department, and our department, and we cannot keep up with the violations that we see, as is illustrated in these photos. What you see on the right is an all-metal, recessed lid, bear-proof dumpster that was not secured. It got tumped over, the bear got inside, had a meal. What you see on the left side with the vertical is a recycling container. Part of what we're going to bring back to council to consider when we evaluate Title 12 and revise it is to change the code so that you can no longer put your recycling in a non-wildlife-proof container. When the law was written back in 2005, there was an assumption that if you put clean recycling into a container, the bear would have no interest. And I can attest, after 8.5 years on this job, that is true. Bears know the difference between a source of food and a bunch of plastic bottles. Unfortunately, because we've given people the less expensive option of having a non-bear-proof recycle container, other people come through the alley, come to the recycle center, and put food waste into those containers. Then it's an easy target for the bears. So what I'm saying is leading up to we need additional staff if we're going to make this organics diversion increase successful and not create more problems than we already have. We cannot keep up with it as it stands. The Aspen police had over 300 bear calls last year, and just to give you some context, it can take staff 3 days to track down who's responsible for a single violation. And we're talking about going from 10% of the restaurants participating in this program to 20%, to 50%, ideally to 100%. So that is going to require that we have additional staff to monitor, educate, and enforce.
This
Oh,
isn't,
yep.
This isn't singular just to compost containers.
It is not.
Right now, we're having issues with bears getting into trash, and as well as you're showing some recycling occasionally, but the problem exists currently.
The problem exists currently. The reason that I'm harping on the need for additional staff is we have this problem that we can barely keep up with right now when the bears are getting at mixed containers. What we're proposing is to increase the containers that are nothing but food, which are going to be a much more attractive target. Yes, very tasty, very inviting.
Well, for a bear.
Unfortunately. Yes, Ward.
I've mentioned this a few times over the years, but on a trip to Jasper one time, I noticed that their bear-proof containers use doorknobs. because bears, as you say, don't have opposable thumbs. So it's a really inexpensive way of making a container. Well, there's no such thing as a bear-proof, I've learned over the years, but bear difficult.
I do believe bear difficult is the more accurate way to describe any of these human-made attempts to keep them out. One of the things that is important to keep in mind is compost collection services or organics collection services, in order to be economically effective, have to use commercial trash trucks. Waste containers, as you just described, cannot be serviced by commercial trucks. It takes a special kind of container for those trucks to grab onto them and mechanically lift them into the trash container. So you'll notice that in downtown Aspen, we have a number of metal containers that we collect trash and recycling that are relatively bear resistant, not quite bear proof, but bear resistant, as long as they're properly latched. Those containers cannot be serviced by a commercial truck. Those containers are manually emptied by our park staff. So in order to have the containers that the commercial industry needs to provide a commercial organics collection service, we are limited in the types of containers that are available on the market at this time.
I'm assuming that all of our parks employees have opposable thumbs.
They do indeed.
So those containers that are manually emptied, in the future, we might use a less expensive latching mechanism. I don't know how many of you have witnessed tourists trying to figure out how to open up the trash container.
I have no dispute with your statement, Ward. I think that's a conversation for another work session, so I'm going to leave it at that and leave it to my parks colleagues. Are there any more questions about wildlife? Yeah, Rachel.
Actually, it's not a question as much as a comment. The space concern and the need for the appropriate equipment makes me think a little about the upcoming redevelopment repairs on the two malls. And I don't know if there would be any space or any possibility that part of that rebuild would help alleviate some of the alley space concerns for perhaps compost materials or something like that. I just don't know, but it just seemed that if this is an oversight of our codes in the past, that perhaps when we do a rebuild, a redevelopment of that area, we can address some of the concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. We are working closely with the community development team during the moratorium and addressing waste as part of those conversations.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the mall space. We're going to be doing some stuff there.
And Liz, I have one other question. Do we have any information from other communities about their bear calls? What volume of bear calls or bears in trash that they deal with? The reason I'm asking is it's not singular to Aspen, Colorado, but I wonder how our performance is comparatively, and I'm just wondering if we don't have it today, maybe we could just ask that question of some other communities or something.
I see Jenna approaching council, and so I suspect Jenna has some kind of response to that is going to be more accurate than mine.
Hi, I'm Jenna. I'm the Community Response Supervisor at the Police Department. So I don't have any numbers on hand for you as far as other communities go, but that's something I can definitely work on getting together to share with council.
Just be interested to call just one or two other places and just find out, I mean, how are we performing? I got to be honest, I mean, I partly asked that because my guess is we're probably not as conscientious as some other mountain communities. It's just a guess. But I'd be interested in to find out if there's any information that.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to expand that actually to be wildlife calls, because while it might be bears here, if you go to Estes Park, it's a different four-legged creature. That would be a helpful comparison for you. Thank you.
Rachel.
And just to add to that, it really only gives you a full picture when they can tell you a little bit about the environmental surrounding of that year. Because if it's a frost year and all the acorns were killed off, you're going to see more bears in town. If it's a wonderful, productive year and they can eat without coming to town, they generally will. So, it's a little unique and specific to an area in its overall climate and drought, things like that this way. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, and if I can just weigh in on that You know, last year we saw low food production in the fall, and that really impacted our numbers, and that's when we saw a big spike in numbers. A lot of the natural food sources were closer to the river corridors, so that was bringing our bear population lower into town. So definitely some of the climate impacts play a big role in that. As well, I've looked at some other cities like Boulder, Durango, and some of their waste management guidelines and rules, and we're actually pretty cutting edge when it comes to the wildlife resistant containers that we're requiring our community, and that's part of what they have to get as a requirement. We're not subsidizing those containers for the community like what that was done in portions of Boulder. So definitely room for improvement, and we want to continue to make this better, and it's been great to be able to partner with Liz and then Parks Department also. I just want to give them a shout out. They've been helping us monitor the alleys every single day in bear system and our bear season and be proactive about making those contacts prior to having an entry. So I think that prevention portion is really key here, and whatever we can do to look to engineer out some of the human behavior issues, that's going to help us in the overall battle that we have.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Liz.
You bet. Any more wildlife questions? Thank you so much, Jenna, for chiming in.
Thank you.
So we've been talking about money, and I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about what Skippy had asked earlier about the cost to businesses as well as the cost to the city of Aspen as we move forward with diverting more organic material out of the landfill. So the potential cost to businesses that we hear back, in addition to the subscription cost, which is certainly a significant cost, there's also the cost of compostable bags. Compostable bags are not only twice as expensive as a petroleum bag, but you usually need to use 2 of those for every one that you would use a single petroleum bag, because the same characteristic that makes a compostable bag compostable makes it fragile. And if you're going to tote things around in a compostable bag, you need at least 2, sometimes 3. So that cost really adds up in a restaurant that is taking multiple loads every night out to their waste containers. Further, there's added time. So think about when you've had your own lunch, maybe up at the mountain, and you've got a tray full of an aluminum can, a candy wrapper, and an apple core. It doesn't take long, but it takes you a little bit longer to put that apple core in the compost and put the recycle in the recycling and then put the rest in the trash. Well, imagine that writ large in a really busy restaurant with dozens of people working. It is an additional labor cost for them, and that's one of their concerns. Now, our answer to some of these concerns that the restaurants have expressed to us is we feel that if you work with us, Ainsley and I can come into your operation and help you streamline that separation process so that it minimizes the extra time that is added with this waste diversion process. We have seen it go from 20% down to 10 or 5% extra time rather than a really high amount. You also don't have to use compostable bags. We have several restaurants that eschew compostable bags entirely, and they use buckets or other containers to tote the food waste out to the bear-proof container without any additional bag cost. The cost of subscription service is a tricky one to put our finger on. If you are a restaurant and you're the only user of your waste containers, you can actually break even or even save money by reducing your trash bill as you increase your compost service collection. However, most of the restaurants in town that can do that are doing it. If it's going to save them money because they are the only ones using those waste containers, they're going to jump on that program. What we're facing now are the 90% of restaurants we have in town that share waste containers with other entities like art galleries, retail, offices, and those places are not going to see the same amount of savings because they're not going to be able to reduce their trash to the same degree that a restaurant is. So that is not a concrete absolute that every restaurant that starts subscribing to a compost collection must face an increase in waste totals, but it is going to be true for a significant number of them. And what I'd like to mention that's not on the slide is there's a couple of things that restaurants can do that will divert organics from the landfill and reduce their cost. Namely, you can donate food. We have a citizen working with city staff right now on trying to facilitate getting edible food from restaurants to the people who can eat them. There are also a number of startup companies, since California is so far ahead of this, they have seen a market and they're using data science to help restaurants reduce the food that needs to be thrown away. So composting organic material is better than landfilling it. But what's better than that is feeding livestock. What's better than that is feeding people. What's better than that and saves the most greenhouse gases and diverts the most material is preventing food waste altogether, which means that these costs are potential costs, not certain costs, if we were to go forward with this organics diversion.
And I love a comment right there. I really appreciate this slide. I think that the 15,000 is on the high side, which is plenty fine. I think we should be, putting out numbers that are not low on purpose. So I'm very supportive of what you've represented here. My experience and truly even just today asking around a few questions, the impacts have definitely been able to be mitigated for. And as you were so quickly to say, is that yes, there'll be increased costs, but it doesn't have to be a full boat. For most people, there are going to be ways to cost save, so the impacts can be minimized. So I just wanted to say thank you for this slide. I think that's a realistic snapshot, and that your additional comments of that there are ways to minimize these impacts is dead on.
And again, it's part of why I keep repeating that we need to make the waste specialist position that Ainsley's currently filling permanent, so that we have the staff time to go out to these restaurants and help them use those tools and find those tools. I would also comment, Tori, on the $15,000 a year. It's hard to put a number on that because I've had businesses estimate to me that they think it's going to cost them $30,000 more a year, but that's coming from a business that hasn't actually tried it yet. So are they overestimating? Are they underestimating? I've had businesses tell me that it's actually costing them $6,000 extra a year. So that's why we landed on the $15,000 a year as a rough average of what businesses might incur as an additional expense. I'd also like to make the point, if council proceeds with making this a legislative solution, it will apply to all the businesses, and therefore there will be an even playing field and the costs will be more equitably distributed across the commercial sector and not just on the retail food sector.
Thanks, Liz.
So let's talk about the cost to the city of Aspen. I'm a bit of a broken record here talking about the additional staff we need. Additional staff does not come free. It costs money. If we're going to make the waste specialist position permanent, that's roughly another $100,000 a year. And if we're going to reinstate a full-time position whose sole job is to go through the alleys, monitor, educate, and enforce, that's another full-time employee that will cost up to $200,000 a year. The full-time person that we could add, that in the current code is referred to as an environmental ranger, they would work closely with the Aspen Police, the Parks, Environmental Health, and I don't think it matters which department that staff person is added to. But we all agree that we need a staff person whose sole job description is to go out into our community and make sure that people understand the wildlife ordinance, that we are monitoring to make sure they're complying with it, and when needed, they have the tools to enforce that ordinance. The other line on this is an optional line. What we heard from the businesses during Ainsley's outreach is their solution to the increased costs is for city council to provide subsidies to the businesses. As you heard me describe in the slide before, staff is not recommending that because we see some other ways around mitigating those costs, but that's certainly an option that council has available, and it is something that the stakeholder group told us they would like council to consider. So that is why that is on this slide. Moving into compliance, we're going to touch on compliance to talk a little bit about why staff is recommending a prohibition on food waste rather than mandating a subscription service. Part of the reason we are recommending that you prohibit food waste rather than mandate a subscription service is if we mandate a subscription service, we are de-incentivizing those other tools I just named: food donation, inventory control. We are saying that you have to subscribe to this waste service, and so what is the incentive for them to get their food waste prevented? What is the incentive for it to get donated? Whereas if we prohibit food waste, we've provided us an incentive for them to do that. But this next slide is the other piece of the compliance. This is a slide taken from the study we did in 2015 when we analyzed the waste coming out of Aspen and being buried at the Pickens County landfill. And you can see that the largest bar here, that's about 35%, is the organic material. 17% of that material was yard waste, despite the fact that since 2005, City of Aspen has prohibited yard waste from being combined with the landfill trash. Why are we still finding 17% of yard waste in our municipal trash? We do not have adequate staff to monitor, educate, and enforce to ensure that doesn't happen. But the even more important piece that I'd like you to take away from this particular graph is when you look at the glass, metals, plastic, and paper, what that represents is 35% of what we found in that waste stream is recyclable. So we have a mandate on the books that says you have to pay for a recycling service. If you have trash service at your house, we have required by law that you are charged for and offered recycling service. And yet, 35% of what we buried in 2015 could have been recycled. That shows me that mandating subscription service is not going to get us to the goals that we want of diverting that organic material, whereas prohibiting the material gets us closer. We have room to grow, as is evidenced by the 17%, but we're getting more of that organic material out of the landfill with a prohibition than we are with a mandated service. So that was a lot of information. I would like to pause for a moment and see if there are other questions council has before we move into talking about funding.
Yep, Ward, go right ahead.
You know, we're presented with numbers all the time about a metric ton. So I did some math on this today, as you are aware. I also serve on CORE, and we talk about we save so many metric tons of carbon this year, but what does that mean to us? It means absolutely nothing. Even on the CORE board, when we talk about a metric ton, we go, well, what is that? So I did some math on the amount of compostable material, organics, that go to the landfill, and using the 3944 tons a year, that equates to 3,534 car trips from New York to LA. It's 9,860,000 miles of carbon CO2 equivalent, or CO2 miles a year in the average U.S. car at 22 miles per gallon. I think it equates to 6,037 days driving back and forth between LA and New York. So I think that in messaging that we should put it in terms that people can understand. A balloon that's 10 yards in diameter weighs 1 ton. If it's filled with CO2, it's 1 ton. So just when we think, oh, that doesn't look like a lot, but when you put it in terms of what that actually means, it looks pretty substantial. So I think perhaps we should have some messaging that not only do we divert 3,944 tons of waste, or we divert all this waste, but we're working on human behavior and environmental awareness, and that the old term used to be reduce, reuse, recycle, but in your terms, it's feed people, feed animals, and inventory control, where you just don't buy so much that you're throwing it away. So I would like to see that we kind of do a little bit of a shift in the messaging on this, that we're really impressing upon people how it's important to change behaviors and environmental consciousness, and how this amount of organic diversion can save us almost 10 million miles driven a year.
That is an impressive figure, and it's actually even more impressive than that, Ward, because the figure you're quoting is assuming that we no longer have any organics in the landfill, and we're talking about the emissions avoided from that. But that doesn't even consider that if we convert some portion of that organic material into compost, we're actually sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's an even more impactful figure than what you just cited, but exactly.
Thanks, Ward. Do you have a couple comments here?
I have questions. I'm not sure if it's best to wait till it's all over or not.
We will pause for questions at the end, but if it's hot on your mind, I'm happy to talk about it now.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not sure there are answers that you have or not, but I'm really thinking about, as this goes forward, who is responsible or fined or whatever for bringing a load of garbage into the Pickens County landfill that has food in it in the future. I'm kind of interested in the mechanics of it. Would it be the waste management hauler who gets fined that you picked up food and you shouldn't have and you should have left it there? Or how does it kind of, the mechanics as we get to further in? So I realize these might be premature. You know, does the county enforce the city's reg once they say this truck is coming from the city? Or what if the hauler picks up some in the city and some in the county and the county has food in it? You know, I kind of wondering about the mechanics. Are there potentials for landfill fees on haulers that are bringing in mixed loads with food anymore? What is the county's composting capacity? I don't think we've reached it, but is there a point at which they're like, we can't keep composting this much, or we haven't been able to sell it all, or where does it go? We've asked before a little bit about the composting revenues, that if we're going to be spending significant dollars to get more compost materials to them, is that a profit center that stays with the county, or can they help us offset some of the cost? I just have also wondered again, and I really appreciate your last explanation on prohibiting food versus mandating. I really like that, but still I would ask, are there any regulations related to the haulers and their responsibility in this that would come to play? Let's see, I have a couple more, but you know, the cost for the subscription services, the collection services, I think that it might be worth looking at whether the city could reduce those costs by the city operating the collection service. I mean, if we're thinking about how do we keep the costs down for the restaurants, and the subscription service seems to be one of the larger components, it may or may not be worth it, but it's just a question I would have. You know, would it be cheaper per month for those if we were more in charge of it? So I think those are my questions for now, and then I'll come back to the next ones.
Okay.
Thank you.
My goodness, you don't disappoint, Rachel.
Oh, those are good.
Lots of good questions.
I like
Look
them
at that. I like it. So I have answers for a lot of them. Let me go through a lot of this. So the mechanics of monitoring is why I keep coming back to we need someone that is their full-time job. What we have learned since 2005 when we changed our waste ordinance is the haulers cannot serve as monitors or enforcers of our regulations. They will not. They are in business to please their customers. So when they pull up to a trash can and they see half of a Christmas tree in there and they know that that's against the rules, they load that thing into the trash truck and they take it up to the landfill, and I only hear about it if a neighbor witnessed it. Right? And I've had several conversations with the haulers about this, and what they say back to me is, the law is your problem. I'm here to please my customers and make money. Unless they are costing me money, unless they're doing something that is going to cost my company money, I am not going to report them to you. I am not going to get my customer in trouble with the city enforcement official, even if I know they're breaking the rules. So we have to be the enforcement mechanism, which is why we need more staff. And what that would look like is literally a person that would open dumpsters and look inside and see, is there food waste in here? How much food waste is in here? Who put it there? The county I seriously doubt is in a position to do any enforcement on our behalf because they have trouble doing the enforcement on their own regulations with their own staff at the working phase. Furthermore, when you bring a load, as you alluded to, you bring a load to the landfill, it's a mix of this neighborhood, that neighborhood, within Aspen, within Basalt. Tracking that back down to who put the wrong thing in there is basically impossible without some really sophisticated monitoring systems that our haulers don't have. So when I talk about monitoring, education, and enforcement, that's the piece of where we would have a person that would literally be going through the alleys, opening up dumpsters and looking at what's inside, and then taking action from there. In terms of your question about compost capacity, I have had conversations with Kathy Hall out at the Pickens County landfill to ask this very question, and she says, oh yeah, we're good. Bring it, we got it. We can take as much as you can handle. We could have every restaurant in town giving us all of their organic material, and they would be able to process it into a product. And to your other question about the profit center, well, you are correct. At the last time Kathy made her report, I guess back in 2021, about the finances of the Pickens County landfill, the compost was making money for them. So that is a profit center for them. They make more than they spend. The hauler capacity may be the limiting factor, and it's why when we get to the staff recommendations later, I am going to describe limiting the scope of this food prohibition to the commercial core and slowly expanding it out into the rest of the city, because as we speak, the haulers are not capable of, if we snap our fingers today, they can't keep up with every resident, every multifamily complex, every business subscribing to a organics collection service. So we need to slowly phase that prohibition and slowly expand where it applies. In terms of the hauler regulations, we can certainly change some of our code to put more burden on the haulers. But again, I'm going to come back to that answer that they are in business to please their customers, and there's a limit to how much influence we can have over what they do with when they interface with their customers. The last thing you talked about were the landfill fees, and it's almost as if you saw my presentation and you're just leading me nicely into the next slide where we're going to talk about costs. Where are we going to get the money to pay for this? Oh, but Tori still has a question. I'll go back.
I just wanted to follow up on one of Rachel's questions there was about the revenue center that the composting is out at the landfill. The part B to that question from her was about county sharing or supporting the program through some of those proceeds. And I don't need an answer for that now, but I do hope that we are talking with the county and asking for their participation in that sense.
So I have had conversations at the staff level with the county staff, and the direction that I have been given is that's a Board of County Commissioners to City Council conversation, not a staff conversation.
All right.
That makes sense, but we're all addressing the same climate emergency.
For sure. And I've had the conversation, and the answer I've gotten back is that is a conversation that needs to happen at a higher level than staff to staff.
Okay.
So funding additional waste programming. As you saw in your packet, staff recognized 4 different ways we could pay for waste programming, additional and current. We could work with the county, as you guys are talking about right now. We could work with the county. You guys could talk to the Board of County Commissioners and say, is there a way that we could partner so that we could share costs, whether that's sharing the profit of the increased organics that we send to them, whether it's charging a surcharge on every load of trash that comes from Aspen out to their facility. There are mechanisms that you guys could discuss with them about cost sharing and revenue generation that is certainly a possibility that other counties have done. We could also, in the middle of this moratorium work, when we're talking about waste and we're talking about changing the land use code, we could add additional fees to the land use code to generate the revenues we need to pay for these programs. We could also go out to the community at large and add a tax and say, this is a community-wide problem. We want to levy a tax, and ask the voters to weigh in on that as a question. And we could keep it as it is. which is we pay for it out of the general fund, which is how we're doing it right now. And there's nothing preventing us from doing that. The consequence of doing that is you'd basically, as council, be doubling the amount of money you're spending on waste programming, which means that you're going to have to figure out where you're going to cut that money in other city programs. So this is the moment where I'm going to pause and ask council, are any of these funding mechanisms things that you would like us to just take off the table altogether? Are there funding mechanisms we have failed to think about? Which of these would you prefer? Yes.
Question, on the Aspen waste surcharge, have you guys given a thought to what that would look like? Because there's different ways to get at that.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, you know, you could most directly charge for the thing that's going in. So you could charge more for organic waste, but we want more organic waste and we want less of other things. So you might raise the rate for the things we want least, which is general trash that goes into the landfill. I mean, there's a few different streams coming in there. So have you given thought to, or do you have a suggestion on which one of those you would charge more for and why?
Our suggestion would be trash that cannot be composted or recycled. And the rough figures we have is for every $10 per ton that we put on loads, that would generate about $100,000.
Council members, another really important part here is that the Paepcke County Solid Waste Ordinance allows Paepcke County to control the disposal of waste generated here within Paepcke County. In theory, that should all be going to their own landfill even. I would say that that is not actively enforced, and so as you increase the fees at the Paepcke County landfill, your trade-off is that you will have more and more municipal waste going to South Canyon landfill and generating the greenhouse gases and other emissions from that additional transportation time. So I just want to be realistic that there's some regional market forces that are very much in play. Maybe it's a little less with organics, but overall, that Paepcke County has to be really sensitive to that in determining tipping fees. Thank you.
We are already well over double the average tipping fee in the state of Colorado at the Paepcke County landfill. And as Sarah states, she's absolutely accurate that there are a number of truckloads that are going to South Canyon because it's worth it for them, especially if they're a company that stages their trucks down valley. And although, as she also said, it is technically against the ordinance, they don't actively enforce it at this time because they are having trouble keeping up with the loads that are coming to them.
Rachel?
Yeah. Thank you. You always come in with a wealth of information for us. I greatly appreciate it. And Sarah as well, because I was going to make the same comment about the county balancing that tipping fee versus going to other locations, and that's the challenge. You know, I have a hard time, the list is pretty general as we're looking at now. And I think that in order to really kick off the program, it's going to have to be at least a 1, if not 2-year allocation from the general fund because, you know, if we want to start moving on it. But I can't see it as a long-term general fund contribution. It would not be appropriate. But the one thing I was thinking about a little bit, because when you talk about municipal tax, these can be pretty tailored. They don't have to be to everything and everybody all the time. And what so I don't have the numbers to know what would generate what, you know, frankly. But it was reminding me of, and I think Ward would probably remember, Colorado used to have a tourism tax statewide that was like a 0.04, you know, 0.4 of one, I mean, 4/100ths of a penny. And it was so small, but it was all that funded the tourism office in Colorado. And it went away when people did not renew it because they thought the state was seeing too much tourism and it was changing things too much. So now that's funded out of the state's general fund. But I just have wondered, what would a really, really small sales tax that you could tailor and ask that it just be on restaurant sales or food and beverage sales in our community? And, you know, if it would take a 20 cents, 20 cents on the dollar. I mean, something too high, we'd throw it away. But if it was something that could raise enough to make a difference here, and we had a track record of a couple years proving the success of the program to the public, I could see that as being reasonable. But I really would need a Pete Stryker to help me work on how small could it be and still make that difference. Targeted specifically to assisting and being reinvested and monitoring the reduction of organics and other waste going into the landfill. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. I'm a little not sure on the new fees on development activity as much as is it more of a one-time thing as opposed to an ongoing. And so how to measure that impact at a one-time fee level is hard. And particularly perhaps more of that is currently geared towards single-family homes as opposed to the commercial enterprises anyhow. So I don't see that as any sort of big bucket or long-term proposal on that. Whether it was a tax on municipal waste generated in Aspen, I think that starts to be a much, much bigger question about what are the services you're getting from that tax. Should we start our own collection company? What is that for? How does it reduce costs perhaps for our people? There's a lot of bigger questions there about what you would be getting for your tax dollar to be improved. And as I said, I could see the general fund for initial support and to start moving on the program, but I don't see it as a long-term source. And those are my thoughts on it. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I agree with a lot of what she just said, both on that starting point of general fund, but then also conversation around that tax increase or the like. But I also agree that I don't have enough information or knowledge in this area to suggest a path at this time. I will say, just, the way that I feel about this is a responsibility. I really think that this is an individual and business, and it comes down to each one of us. So I'm looking for equitability and sharing of the impact costs, but I do think that this is something that our monies do need to go towards supporting, because it is our responsibility. Our waste generation, diversion is something that I think each one of us needs to take responsibility for. But I agree with a lot of Rachel's approach on the funding question here. Skippy?
A follow-up
And Ward?
question, comment, hybrid, I guess. Just knowing that the compost we do currently take in is cash flow positive for us, over time, like it's going to take some time to spin this thing up, right? And any business or endeavor, you got to have some upfront investment. Is that a business that scales? Like if we're at 10x the organics coming in, are we making more per pound, or are we making less because our market is limited? And I want to understand that better, because I'm wondering if this can ultimately fund itself in partial or in whole from the revenues that come out of that. Maybe there's even like the equivalent of a dividend that goes back to a business. They pay the upfront cost for the hauling, but we're able to put dollars back in their product from proceeds. What are your thoughts on that?
So since I don't actually run the landfill, I communicate closely with Kathy Hall, who does run the landfill, and it does not always make money, the composting program. It did last year, but it has also lost money. And I don't have a great idea. I don't have a solid answer for you, Skippy, in terms of that scaling question. Based on my conversations with Kathy, my best guess is that it doesn't. It actually makes less money as you scale the operation. It also would require charging more for the organic material coming across the scale. And back to Sarah's point of that would actually disincentivize people to bring them more organics. So that's a conversation I could certainly explore with the staff at Pickens County Solid Waste Center, but I don't have a good, ready answer for you there. It is possible. It is also, the profit that they have made there is around $250,000 to $350,000. So it is not a huge profit when you take into account that the landfill made $7 million.
Sure.
Additionally, council, even in the years that it's positive for this program, it does go to subsidize some of the other activities of the landfill to help. It's an enterprise fund, so it can take the profits from this particular program and use it to subsidize one that doesn't perform. A good example might be book collection recycling, because it's super heavy, super expensive to transfer those materials to a recycling center that will take them. The other thing is I wanted clarification on with your question, Councilmember Meseros, around, our assumption has been that we would utilize the county's organics diversion program to create the compost. And I would want to understand if there's a request for us to look at developing our own program for these wastes. Because the way you worded that, you used the word "we" a lot when it's not our program. It is Pickens County's program. So I would like clarification if your interest is for us to examine running our own organics diversion and composting, or just organics diversion.
Yeah, no, I'm not making that suggestion at this point. I'm just trying to understand kind of the mechanics better. There's just not many things that we do as a government that tend to be profitable, and this is one that could be. And so if we're trying to figure out a financial equation, looking at the far side of that, I think is just a smart thing for us to do. And if it turns out that we find out that it is wildly profitable, then maybe we do want to have it on our own. But I don't have nearly enough information to know that right now.
Yeah, Sarah has said it very well. It is an enterprise zone. Some things lose money, some things make money. But the other expense that the county does have is to save for the eventual closure. And that landfill will be monitored forever afterwards, and remediation if there's any contamination, leaks, or plumes underneath. And so that's a very expensive nut that they're saving for.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Well, no.
No, I'm just,
Oh, okay.
at the bad news of the future.
So,
Yeah, Rachel is exactly right. It is going to be a huge expense on the county's part for the next 30 years after they close that landfill. It's going to be a very expensive $1 million a year to monitor and comply with state and federal regulations when they close that facility.
got it.
Ward, did you have some more input here, possible funding options or any other thoughts?
Yeah, generally speaking, I don't like the idea that somebody is not contributing directly to the problem being taxed or a fee applied to them for. I like to see that those that are generating the need wind up paying for it. But that being said, I certainly support solid waste diversion increase through construction by the volume of construction waste that goes to the landfill. But as far as organics, I just have a philosophical problem with that, and I can be talked off the cliff, but that was, it's like gasoline tax. You put a tax on gasoline, it goes to road maintenance. I think that's fair. I think a toll road is fair because you pay to use the road. As far as municipal taxes are concerned, I asked for Sarah and Pete to inform me on this, but I think there is a maximum tax at a municipality. Is it a sales tax maximum? And I'd be really curious of where we are on that in relation to some of the other needs that we may have for funding for perhaps workforce housing or other areas. And where are we on, am I correct that there is a maximum that a community can levy?
I would need to get back to you. I don't know quite how it's worded in Colorado for that. I would say, though, there should be some sensitivity to the impacts, particularly to locals, as that rate is climbing for basic services.
Yeah, and I thought somewhere in the packet, in the presentation, was rebate was mentioned. So if it was a local, we have a food tax rebate, perhaps we could have a composting rebate. I don't know what other municipalities are doing to fund this, but I'd be interested to see, Tori had mentioned, how are we performing to other mountain communities? I know that San Francisco has been doing composting or organics for quite a while, and I'm curious if how they're funding it or how other municipalities that have successful programs are funding it. I think that I'm leaning more towards the 500,000 than the 200,000 because I think we need to be incentivizing and rewarding people for good behavior. We've gone through the last 2 years of mandates, and I'm really cautious about having another mandate about organics. Find a way to get high participation without doing mandates, if that's possible. And I agree with Rachel, and I think that this starting off, it's going to need funding from the general fund. But as we see coming up on capital projects, the general fund can be taxed pretty heavily, and it has a direct impact on what we can do as a community in the future. So I'm supportive of this. I think it's important work, and I'd like to see the messaging about environmental stewardship and awareness and behavioral modification voluntarily to come into higher compliance, to make it make people feel that they're part of a solution instead of just part of the problem. But just generally, I don't like imposing a fee on somebody that's not a direct contributor to the problem.
Okay, thank you.
John, any input here?
Yeah, just real quick, I fully support this. I really agree with Liz's logic on what's. Sorry. Just wanted to thank Liz for her logic on this issue. It's very sound. It's pretty clear we need to do this. I'm in full support, especially since today's New York Times is saying that the latest IPCC report has said climate change is harming the planet faster than we can adapt. We need to get a move on this. So, and also I agree with Rachel on her approach to how we pay for this. I think there's a lot of logic in her reasoning there too.
Thanks, John.
Couple different ways. Thanks.
Thank you. Skippy.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to hear everybody first, make sure I wasn't missing anything. First, you kind of mentioned this up top, but just, for the community, I think, one of the reasons to focus on this well is just we have a lot of control in this process. We'd love to see everything get recycled, but it doesn't get recycled in our backyard and sometimes not even in our back country. And so we just, even if we do everything right, we don't know really what happens. And this is an instance where we can kind of have a lot more control and guarantee of results. And so, we have the opportunity as individuals to really do our part, which feels good. So I think that's important. As to the funding question, agreed, the general fund to start is a good place to go. But I would hope that that's not an ongoing and forever condition. I really hope we can kind of treat this like a startup endeavor, right? We've got like 2 years to get to our break even and, hopefully 4 years, and we've found a way to make this profitable in some way for us or for our community. I'm not a hard no, but the new development fees, I'd really lean away from that. I think we just crush our criminal core already, and we want to eat at the restaurants that are composting our food, and each time we do this, we make it harder for that to be the case. So that would be my last choice on here. And then, I guess kind of broader points, I was so happy to see the survey. The community's really behind this, right? People want to do this. Business owners want to do this. I talked to them individually, and they're frustrated by their lack of composting. So I really just want to lean into that and think about supporting them as much as is possible. I was thinking about people like to watch videos, right? But they have Comcast that delivers them videos, and all people want to do is talk about how much they hate Comcast and how awful they are, and then they've got Netflix over here, and they just want to talk about all their favorite Netflix shows, and we want to be Netflix in this scenario. We really want to make it as easy as possible for people to do the thing they want to do. And I think we want to give them opportunities to like really show that and demonstrate it. You talk about behavior change. Like, can we give people the gold, silver, or bronze medal that goes on their window for their participation? You know, can we talk about the number of bears' lives or car miles that they've saved from their compost and give them that accreditation and let them brag about their part in this system? I think, you know, that's going to be really helpful. And then just long-term or middle-term, as we think about this, the general fund's going to fund these human beings that need to go out and look at things and develop the program and work with owners, but the human being's time does not scale. And so I really want to be looking at what other communities are doing, utilizing tech and automation to help with this stuff. You know, I think we've had the conversation about Korea, and when you put your thing in, it knows whether it's organic or not, and it lets you take it or not. At some point, we want to have the mechanism set up to run and police itself as much as possible, and that will also alleviate some of those, you know, strains on the general fund while hopefully we're running this thing up. So I just want to start looking at that stuff now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing, basically, just to make sure that I've heard properly from council, there does not seem to be much interest in adding fees as part of the land use code revision process. I'm hearing support for initially using monies from the general fund to get going, but you are directing staff to look into other funding mechanisms. It seems like taxing, if we can develop a tax that is small enough to not be painful and directly related to the source of the waste material, that is the preference of council, is to look into that. In terms of the partnership and surcharge on waste fees at the Pickens County landfill, I leave that to council to discuss with your colleagues at the Board of Commissions.
Just to add on that, let me, if you don't mind, have some conversation at the county manager's office level prior to being on a joint meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, thank you. Direction. Love direction. Like follow. Oh, no, wait.
That's
Back
great.
it up.
That's great direction. The one thing that I had said in my original questions, and is something to look at later, is whether not taking over the composting action, but the collection service, is it more affordable or not? And just something for you to look at in between this meetings, you know.
Thank you. I wrote a note to myself and then I turned my notebook
Yeah,
over.
It happens.
To that question, so adding a sanitation collection service to the city of Aspen would be an inordinately expensive endeavor. So these trucks that collect this material start at $150,000 to $200,000. You got to have specialized staff. You got to have a place to maintain them. You got to have a place to store them. It would be really expensive to start that kind of endeavor on behalf of the city. So if that's the kind of money you're directing that council wants staff to investigate, that's a lot larger pool of money than what I have suggested so far. And it's developing an entirely new department for the city to run and manage and staff.
No, I guess I will accept that answer, but I was just kind of thinking, well, if there's 102 restaurants and people are saying you're going to be, you know, $15,000 of expense and $10,000 of that is the subscription service, that's an awful lot of revenue that's out there that is going to be paid to a private provider, and that's great, but I'd hate to have people kind of held by the short hairs. We only have one provider, and they're going to charge me $1,000 a month. And now we've made the law that you have to do this, and there's only one provider they can go to. You know, so that was a little more of my concern. Is are we going to mandate something that, you know, is a monopoly for one small business, and we're mandating something we don't want to get into the private sector side of it, and I can certainly understand why. But on the other hand, is it something that will become an uncontrollable expense for others with no competition in the market? So those were my thoughts.
Absolutely. At the moment, there are 2 haulers that are offering that service, and based on our Ainsley and I's latest conversation, there's a 3rd hauler interested in moving into that space. So I don't know at this moment in time that we're in danger of supporting a monopoly on this service, and I do know that it would be a huge endeavor for the city to take on that as an additional department.
And so the people who currently come around and collect areas that are Hunter Creek, they are a contracted service that the county landfill is paying for, or are they county landfill employees who are running around collecting the compost at Hunter Creek?
At Hunter Creek, that's contracted via Waste Management. So of course, you choose a complicated thing for me to answer, Rachel. Waste Management has the contract with Hunter Creek. Waste Management subcontracts with Evergreen Zero Waste to haul compostable material, organic material from Hunter Creek out to the Pickens County landfill. Pickens County staff are not involved at all.
Okay, I was just wondering who's running all those little trucks around now. Thank you.
Oh, yes.
Warden and Skippy.
Yeah, this is kind of out of the box, but wondering about starting it as seasonally, that in the winter when the odors are low and the bears are snoozing, might be a really easy time to start. And in the summer when the bears are around and the odors are more of a problem. I'm just tossing that out there to consider.
That is a reasonable path of logic to think about this. What I would counter with is we will not achieve our goals that you set in January if we take that path.
Thanks, Ward. Skippy?
Just to put a little liner note on Rachel's comments, I wouldn't ask you guys to go develop any new system first, but I do know that the haulers are a point of difficulty in a lot of our waste hauling, whether it's recycling or trash or whatever. And so, you know, in this and in the rest, if we keep coming back to the haulers are the issue or not, I would hope you'd bring that back to us, because if there's one choke point where all of our problems are meeting, then we may choose to have that as our intervention point in the future and just think of it as an opportunity. So just to be mindful and bring it back if that is the case.
Okay, thank you.
Next steps.
Okay. Staff recommendations. So just to summarize, what we're recommending here tonight is we are saying that we need to update Title 12. That is our highest priority at this stage. And what we need to know from council tonight is, as part of those revisions, are you in support and directing staff to make prohibiting food waste part of those revisions? In other words, we would start in the commercial core, and then between 2 and 5 years later, it would expand to the lodging district and multifamilies, and then 2 to 5 years later, it would encompass the entire town. It would also, we also recommended, as you saw in the memo, a 12-month grace period. So if you choose to make this prohibition on food waste in the code, we would say you have 12 months from the time you pass the code to before you're subject to a ticket. That will allow staff and businesses to get the equipment they need, the training they need to adapt to this, and by the time a year passes, hopefully we've got everybody on board rather than having it more instantaneous.
Rachel?
Thank you. The first answer is yes, I'm supportive of that prohibition. I didn't mention it in my comments before, but you had used the term phased in, and I think it's very important that we are presenting this in that ordinance with kind of a step-by-step of how it will be phased in. So I think that that's important for me. And I think I agree with the commercial core and then incrementally expand the zones, but you might want to make it the commercial core or food service establishments, because we do have partners outside of the core who are either restaurants or they are doing food service at their bar in their hotel. So I think we try to, include those as well. So it's an even playing field among restaurants who might not be in the core. And then I can understand the logic of a 12-month grace period, but I would think about having some intermediate steps, because if somebody tells me I have 12 months to do something and fill in my taxes, I might not start until 11 months and 2 weeks. And I think having some intermediate steps would make sense, and maybe even incentives that you've accomplished this and you're fully with the program 6 months in, or something like that, or recognition awards as Skippy had pointed out. But I would be a little nervous about having a lot of things wait to the last minute and then suddenly everyone filling this room to say, we just can't do this, it's too difficult. So we have to think about that a little more. Otherwise, thank you very much. I agree with the directions.
Thank you. I see a thumbs up from Skippy. He agrees with these staff
Should I
recommendations.
put it in this directional microphone so it hears?
Or this staff recommendation, yeah.
I'm a thumbs up as well, and I want to support what Rachel just shared with you on these 3 points. I agree. I'll go John and then Ward.
I agree as well. The only thing I would add is I'd actually like to see it happen faster. That's all.
Okay.
I agree, but I'm really cognizant of the economic impact it's going to have on the restaurants. So I'd really like to tie the prohibition on food waste to some kind of incentives to somehow reward them or mitigate or minimize the economic impacts on the restaurants. Certainly in principle, I have 2 thumbs up on all this, but I see what's happening with the restaurant turnover, the cost of meals and everything else, and so I'm really cautious about having a mandate on this without having some way to help fund it to the restaurants.
Okay. So our next staff recommendation is to increase staffing levels, make the waste specialist position that Ainsley's currently filling a permanent part of the environmental health team, and to reinstate the environmental ranger position, which would be the person in charge of monitoring, educating, and enforcing the zone that was first.
Yep.
Sarah
Because,
wants
yes,
to jump in.
and you should do this in contemplation of your other general fund obligations until after you've had your financial update on March 7th. So you have an understanding of the health of the general fund, would be my recommendation. So we don't have to have direction on this one tonight, but your general sentiments would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that. My general sentiment on this is that I agree with the waste specialist position becoming permanent. I'm looking forward to more information to talk about the environmental ranger position, and that for me is on 2 fronts. That's one, general fund capacity and needs, demands, but that's also about how that works into other staffing programs that I might not be aware of right now. So I'm supportive of the first, and I'll need more information on the second, and both of these determined on a financial update that's coming next week. So, Skippy, can we start down with you, just on these 2 points?
Yeah, I look forward.
Just general input.
Yes, and I look forward to that, but yes, in the interim.
Okay.
I agree with Tori. I think that we really need to make at least a statement that the waste specialist position should become permanent and go forward. And I will look to the general financial situation, but it might be something that the environmental ranger could be for the summer, and think about it as a part-time position for the summer. So at least to have somebody a little more out there for the bears and things like that. But I'll wait for the larger update as well. Thank you.
Of course.
John and then Ward?
My only comment would be to see if there was any way the county could contribute to the environmental ranger position, if possible. Otherwise, I think the waste specialist position should be funded and be permanent. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm in favor of this, but I want to find a way that enforcement and fines are calculated into this, so if we can have the additional costs mitigated by fees or fines. I think it's important work, but I want to look at what the impacts it has on in the near term on the general fund. So I'll hold off until we see what the financials are. But I'd really like to see some kind of funding for this through the use of the ranger position.
Thanks, Ward. Good input.
Okay. The last recommendation is talking about the funding mechanism, and we spent some time on that. We will investigate the various taxes and making sure that they are directly related to the waste streams, come back to you with some numbers, what that might look like. And it sounds like there's support for the waste specialist position to be made permanent, but there's a bit of question about the full-time environmental ranger, and you guys have that financial update in March, which will solidify where you stand on all of that. And Sarah is going to have a conversation at city manager to county manager about the possibility of the surcharges. That won't be something I have to worry about, is my point.
Yes.
So I don't think we have any more questions. I think we've covered the questions. So next steps, we'll come back to you with a revised ordinance, and we'll come back to you with the funding options per the direction we just discussed. These will likely be 2 different sessions. The revised ordinance is pretty cooked. I've been working on this for several years, and so it's not going to take that much longer on my side to get an ordinance put together to present to you now that I have some direction from you. But the funding question is something that we're going to need to spend more time on, and so those will probably be 2 different sessions. And when we come back, we will likely have our partners at the Police and the Parks Department here to talk about a number of different changes we would like to make to Title 12 in the Waste Ordinance Code, as well as our partners at Community Development. And we know that you guys have a lot going on right now, so I don't know exactly when we're going to be before you again with this revised ordinance, but we will get there just as soon as it is feasible, both for us and for council's schedule. So the last thing is, I cannot possibly express how deeply I appreciate the thought and energy and support that this council has offered to us. Lots of people don't like to talk about trash, and you guys are always willing to talk a little trash with us. Thank you.
Liz, thanks so much. Last comment for me, I want us to be cognizant of those goals that we spoke about in the beginning. Organics diversion is one part of it, but we've set some pretty aggressive goals for waste management and truly waste reduction. So I just want to make sure that we're all, this is one piece of the puzzle for overarching goals.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. This has been a great presentation. A little bit of time for us, but well worth it. Great work from you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys both.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ainsley. Yeah, you guys go ahead, take a couple minutes while we switch over.
Good thing you're strong.
Did you get a solution to your? Thank you, ma'am. Did you get, do you have power?
No, I think I'm good though. Okay. So I just gotta get on WebEx and do all that. Thank you.
Thank you for your patience. It was a long way.
I learned a lot.
Well, there you go.
My friend Chris is visiting.
Chris, I'm CJ. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming. Yeah, of course. It's great to watch you guys.
Here, Jenna, let me forward this over to you. Sure.
It's actually Ginna.
Oh, sorry. Really?
Yep. My real name's Virginia.
Oh, okay.
There, that's me.
Gotcha. Okay.
Forward it to me.
Yep, there you go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You have a good night.
Yeah, thanks for being here for that.
Sarah, how's your knee doing? Yeah. Getting around good.
Turn the fan off.
It's 72 in the room, but
Yeah,
it's directly cold. It's directly cold air coming
place, basically where you are is better.
Yeah, there's no vents on that side.
I wanna sit there.
Shirley, how's Dave doing? How's Dave?
About the same. His
My son's father.
eye is getting better.
Living in teepees.
Oh. His retina is healed. Now he's gotta have cataract surgery. But it's the back that just keeps him from getting around. He's got so much back pain, and we just can't really figure out how to make it better.
Okay.
I know. He needs a physical trainer who's not me.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I can rise to that level, but if there's any small things or anything I can do to help,
Well, thank you.
I mean, honestly, one of those things
No.
like, boy, if somebody could go get this or do this, I'm there for you. So if
He,
anything ever came up,
He has been going to the lunches at the senior center and getting out and socializing a little bit, which is awesome. It's great for him, and it gives me a break.
yeah. Well, if he ever needs a ride somewhere or this, that, just,
Tori, thank you.
I'm available. I think you have my phone number, so.
Well, you know Dave, he'll talk your ear off.
Yeah, it's all good. We all need somebody. So I love you guys. So if I can help you in any way, let me know. Yes. All right, let's go ahead and get back on.
Yep. Oh, I want a tall chair. I'm short enough as it is.
I got tea to warm me up because I don't want to. I have a giant overcoat. It seems ridiculous to wear training. That's not just. I got one.
Is Amy in there? All right, Amy, we're ready to get back? Yeah, we're ready.
Turn off your
Like a cape.
volume.
Thank you.
Volume and turn it off. No, that one
5
there.
seconds, guys.
Yep, turn
3,
that all the way off.
2.
Okay, well, on WebEx,
All right.
I have it.
you have to
Thanks so
turn that
much
off.
for you sticking with us or joining us.
All the
This
way
is the
down.
Aspen
You
City
got it.
Council meeting continuing tonight. This is February 28, 2022. We had our first item, which was our council goal update on organic diversion, and now we are on to another council goal update, which is on childcare.
I bet we can be faster.
Great.
Yeah,
Great.
and let me see if it's all right and share my screen.
You certainly may. Council, I'm going to
You
forward
got it.
you some bear information that was shared with me during the meeting.
Just the bare necessities for me, please.
It will be.
Okay.
Damn it, Ward.
Right there. Got a little bag down there.
It's like, where did the mouse go?
Oh, it went away. Nicely done.
Okay, that technology worked, so yay. Thank you, Mayor and City Council members, for your time tonight. We have a second update and not a real long one, but hopefully it'll show the progress that we're making and that we keep moving along on this goal. So I took the opportunity in the memo a little bit to give you a little more background in some of the questions that came up at the last session and to be able to answer those a little bit. So we can go through that. But this is just the same slide that reminds you what that goal is for childcare capacity and what it is, the different components that we're working toward. So this is a screen that also was covered in the memo, and I just put it up here. We don't have to spend a lot of time, but I was hoping that if you had questions, it would be helpful to have the visual up there and we could talk that through as well. This just gives you a sense of the current programs in Pitkin County. And by the way, I really want to send kudos out to all those folks because like everybody, this has been a tough couple of years and they have been consistently there, you know, there for the kids, there for the families and doing the best to provide that care that we expect. A couple of things just to clarify on here. Some of these things are known to us, but most of these are reported in an annual survey. So every year in the fall, we ask the directors to answer questions about their programs. And there's a lot of questions about quality, about staffing, turnover, about all of that. This just captures what they reported in terms of how many days in the year that they're open or how many days a week they're open. And so not every program reports to us. And so what you're seeing there is what they reported or what we know about the programs if they didn't report in that survey.
Quick question, Shirley, and I appreciate you telling us what the Colorado Shines rating is, but we don't know, is 4 the highest or 1 the highest?
Good question. 5 is the highest. There's 5 levels. 1 is the lowest, and that strictly means that people are licensed and they are licensed in good standing. They work then, it's a self-directed step to get to level 2, and then they have a third-party observer from the state come out and they earn points to get to levels 3, 4, and 5. Thank you. Other questions? Okay. This is just to recap a little bit the questions that we got and the hopes to answer that about wait lists. And I think we all agree that wait lists are hard to manage at this point. They're hard to tell real numbers. This is what was reported to us in the last 3 weeks to a month's time from programs. So I look at this and what I do know, just even from talking to those directors, is that there is always the assumption that people put their names on all of the wait lists. And I think some people do. We also learned that many people don't because they want specific location, specific program, philosophy, or they want certain hours and cost as a factor. So there's a little bit of that. What I did is I put this together from the programs from Pitkin County, so here to outlying Basalt. And I think the numbers tell you the story in the first place, but the other part of this is even if we took half of those numbers, and the other information that I gave you a little bit in the memo had to do with how many children you could have in a classroom. So for infants, it's really only 8 children, 10 or 12 for toddlers, 16 is ideal for preschoolers. So when you look at these numbers and translate that into, if it were half of that number, you would still need 10 more infant rooms to accommodate those numbers. So I think that puts it in perspective a little bit more rather than just that many children, which is still a big number. Same thing happens with the toddlers and then the preschoolers with 16 in a room. That could equate to as many as 5 or 6 more rooms. We aren't there yet, but I think the need is there. And obviously some people are going to make other decisions, do something else, and that's all good too. But this sort of capsulizes that for you. So the other questions that you asked us to come back with some answers to had to do with the history and the background on the yellow brick building. So fortunately, because it was through some different finance systems, we had some of those numbers. And Rachel, I think you actually estimated that it was 1.5 million and you were within $20,000. So good memory. So that was the cash purchase price. And quite honestly, there were playing fields and there were other agreements, and it was really complicated, and quite honestly, I'm not sure I ever knew that entire story. And then what I outlined for you in the memo as well was the ongoing investments. I believe there's been, at this point, 2 new roofs that were put on that building, one shortly after, or maybe even before the city actually purchased it, because it was in bad shape. It was leaking, and there were buckets and those upside-down umbrellas and things all over in that building. Probably for the good thing, nobody really took pictures of what that looked like at that point in time. So all told, it was over $2 million, $2,250,000 invested in the building. The roof, there were windows and doors, floor coverings, a lot of those things. And then just to make you aware that ongoing operationally, there is a subsidy. And just to maintain that building, in order for childcare programs to be able to afford to be there, we spend more every year by quite a bit, actually, than what we take in for that building. So that is an ongoing investment for the city and for Kids First. And then just to give you an average figure, there are 14 classrooms in that building. They are all slightly different sizes, but the average rent that somebody pays per classroom is $746 a month. On top of that, they do pay a prorated amount for utilities, trash pickup, that sort of thing. But that sort of gives you that. I think that answers your questions.
Yes, thank you for creating the document and the history, because it's just really important when we're looking at subsidized space and
agree.
the improvements that have been made over the years to benefit the community, the children in the center, and the providers. So I appreciate that. And just a moment on the original purchase, the rest of the deal was to use parks and open space funds to buy the land from Tom Moore that's behind the schools that became the ball fields. And then we shared use of those fields, so it's mutually beneficial to the Parks and
Okay.
Open Space Program for the adult rec leagues. And we agreed that we would do the maintenance and water for the first 10 years. So the two things combined came up to roughly the amount of the appraisal of the yellow brick property, which was around $3.9 million at the time. And the school was very interested in that open space land because they were originally planning on purchasing it from Tom Moore when he did his whole subdivision around them. But at the end of the day, the school district didn't have the money, and the Moore subdivision plans in the alternate were to make that private open space. And that's how they got their points with the county GMQS. But we stepped in to buy that open space and make it public open space to benefit the school. So those were the two components that came together to acquire the yellow brick.
And then, do you remember, because there was something involved, I thought, too, that allowed the rest of the yellow brick park to be developed as part of that swap, and that was also parks and open space, probably.
I don't recall them as having put in direct money into the yellow brick as much as just the purchase of the land from Tom Moore.
Okay,
And then the maintenance and building the fields and everything like that.
thanks, Rachel. Some of the other questions that have come up have to do with what is going on in our community outside of the city, and that involves the Aspen School District, Town of Basalt, and Town of Snowmass Village. And so that was another area that I talked about a little bit in the memo. I did have a meeting with School District Superintendent and Assistant Superintendent a week ago Friday. And they stressed that they're still in the planning stage, but at this point, they have the bond money to build a new early childhood center. Their plans right now are to relocate the 5 classrooms that they currently have, but they have them in 3 different buildings, including a construction trailer, put them in that building. They plan to move the kindergarten 5 classrooms into that building, and then move the 5th grade from the middle school down to the elementary school. We talked a little bit about whether they were considering year-round care instead of school year care. That has not been decided. And they wanted to know more about possibly having the school district own the building, but contracting outside of their staff and employees to run the childcare program. So I don't know, they both told me actually that it was probably a 2-year down the road plan for that building to be ready and open for kids.
I'm just not clued in at all on that, but are those current classrooms primarily for school district employees' children?
No,
Or they have open to the general public and wait list and everything
They
else?
are open to the public, but they follow the school calendar, both days closed and typical hours that they're open. So they actually did tell me that they struggle because they have 1 room of infants, 1 toddler room, and 3 preschool rooms. And their infant room has not been filled this year. And so there was a question around, why is that if there's so much need? And, honestly, there's probably a lot of different reasons, but I think it really has to do with the schedule. If you have a baby and you have to work full-time year-round, you're not going to enroll there and then struggle to figure out what you're going to do in the summer. It's just not an option for people. And that's where that conversation about being open year-round came from. So. Thank you. Yeah, I think they have a lot of things to figure out yet.
Could you please also address the state mandate for a public school district to be providing preschool for therapeutic services? There's some state mandates that affect the school district's choices.
And I don't know all the details, but the Colorado preschool program funding is distributed from the Department of Education through school districts. And they have an obligation to house that program, to administer that program. Now, most schools, and Aspen School District included, they house a great deal of those students in their preschool. They also, because they want to give parents choice, parents can choose community programs that meet those standards, and then the school district pays a tuition rate to those other schools. Now, all of this is due to change, and in ways that we aren't entirely sure yet, because universal preschool funding is coming from the state in the fall of 2023. There is actually, probably as of July this year, there will be a new Department of Early Childhood Education at the state level, and they are looking for who that executive director will be and how to put that program together. The intent is to combine all of the different funding, whether that's the CCAP for low-income families, the Colorado preschool program, there's special ed funding, all of that, into a department that serves just young children. So they have a really aggressive timeline to do that, and it'll be interesting to see just how that rolls out. So for the next year, after this year, the next school year, it will still be CPP administered by the school district and housed there. So I think the school district is well aware of that, and I think they are looking at some potential changes as these other changes come from the state. So that's kind of a stay tuned sort of conversation. The town of Basalt has awarded a design contract for an early childhood education building on the land that they own in the Willits subdivision. It's kind of it's what borders in between the housing part of Willits and the commercial part of Willits. And they also have awarded, they have an agreement with Michelle Oger at Blue Lake to be the operator of that program. So their intention is for the operator and the designer to work together to develop that program to seek additional funding because they also don't have that building fully funded. But they've really moved on that in the last, I would say, 6 months and moved that along quite quickly. And then the town of Snowmass Village is currently working with their consultants to determine the need and the feasibility of expanding, especially year-round care that includes infants in Snowmass Village. So that'll be interesting. I've been in touch with the folks up there and the consultants, and it'll be interesting. It's hard, you know, even all of our data, it usually points to Paepcke County overall. So to really isolate Snowmass Village is a little bit of a challenge. So, and then the other thing, which I don't have a separate slide for, but in the memo I talked about the policy and the future planning and the funding. And just this week they announced what they're calling circle grants, which is more of the stimulus funding that's going through the state that will be available to early childhood programs, but both existing programs and other entities, and they are specifically looking for innovative solutions for childcare and infant toddler childcare. So they've got 2 rounds. The first one is due March 30th. The second one happens in May. But we are also working with the consultant that we mentioned to really make the most of those funding opportunities. There's quite a range from just like maybe $20,000 up to $750,000. So that presents some opportunities for us as well. And I didn't have nearly as much to say tonight as Liz and her group. So this is what's coming up next for us. You will see the design contract approval, I believe, if all goes well, on the March 8th agenda. And another, either a work session or an info-only memo on that April 18th date. Same supports that we listed the last time we were here talking to you, needed from City Council. So it's something that the Kids First Advisory Board is definitely committed to working on, all of these, you know, from the public support to the housing solutions. So, questions, direction?
All right. Board.
Yeah, a couple. Is BG3, is that space also have housing for childcare providers factored in?
No, Burlingame 3 is generally APSHA deed restriction unless directed otherwise by council, and we'd have to go back and review I'm looking at Jim, because we'd have to go back and review the court settlements on those deed restrictions just to verify compliance. It's certainly an option for the council to consider. The other thing with that site, we are evaluating that there is 2 units not constructed yet to hit the maximum unit count for the neighborhood. And so we are looking at what's the best use of those 2 remaining units still to be constructed. And does it perhaps support this goal? Shirley, I'd really appreciate if you could go back 1 slide where you have your ask of council. That's a helpful area for them to have some moments to read. Thanks.
Yeah, another question was on the Aspen School District, and it seems we'll have a better feel for this after the RFP for the yellow brick rooms that are available, but curious if the school district is asking for somebody else to administer the program, that means that somebody else has to staff it and find a director. And if the city or the Kids First, what I'm looking at is a trade-off between extended usage and in exchange for perhaps administering the program, going to a 12-month program instead of a school year program. But we'll get a better feel for what's out there for people to provide that service after we take a look at what the reply to your RFP for Yellow Brick.
Right. You know, that's a really good question. it's so interesting because I think people often assume that people who educate kids that are kindergarten and older also know the early childhood world. And the school district at this point has actually been abundantly clear that they don't. And it is a whole different model. You know, public schools, they're entirely publicly funded. They don't really worry a great deal about tuition and how much and does it balance and is it on time and all of that sort of thing. So when they started thinking about year-round education, you know, I've met with them a few different times and talked about different consultants that could help them put that model together, or that I've given them some examples of RFPs if that's the way they wanted to go. And I've offered certainly our help from our department. And I think they're kind of still in the mulling it over and figuring out. And I don't know how soon they would consider doing something like that. So definitely continued conversations.
Another question, CMC, they have a curriculum for childcare, so CMC is more or less an on-the-job training?
They do. They have a certification program for directors, they have an associate's, and they have their 4-year education, elementary ed degree has a certificate for early childhood education. So that is something that is available, and we've had a few folks start that program. It's relatively new, so we haven't had anybody finish it yet, through CMC.
So I'd really be interested in some kind of program where a grant might be available to somebody going through that program and in exchange for them working the upper end of the valley in childcare providing.
I've had that same thought.
City
In
manager
fact,
may
I'm
have had
pretty
that
sure
thought
we
as
have a
well.
meeting tomorrow.
We do.
Yes, it's an excellent idea. Ward, would you like to come to our meeting?
Yeah, I don't have anything else to do the rest of the week.
Along the same lines, the proposed plans for Burlingame Childcare Facility, do those have any housing units? Does that proposal have any housing units involved in it?
That's something, once we have an architectural and design team established, that we want to look at. But again, we have a maximum of housing units in the settlement agreement. So it's about how do we handle that? So whether it's actually attached to the new facility or whether we think through those last 2 lots and providing some funds from the Kids First Fund to construct those units in order to have them restricted only to be for childcare providers. There's lots of different ways that it could be attacked, so to speak. But I'll say whatever we can do in Burlingame is gonna not even put a dent.
Yeah.
Because of that limit of 2 additional units.
Comments now or hold them till later? All right, Rachel?
Thank you for such a comprehensive report and where we seem to be now with things that are very hard to track in many ways, but really appreciate that. 2 comments. One is, I think I've mentioned this before, but a bill passed at the State House either last year or is beginning to take effect now. I think it was House Bill 1164 related to school districts, that they will all need to raise their mill levies 1 mill a year for at least the next 20 years, or until they're fully funded without state money coming in. And the courts have decided that the school district boards can do this without public votes. So that's kind of interesting as to where that law is going. But what it really strikes me is I'd really like to know what is the intersection of our school district becoming more fully funded and the expiration of the sales tax that we have dedicated to the schools in 5-year increments, particularly because if they can become fully funded as they should be by property tax and per that legislation, we as a city would not need to renew that tax for the school and could potentially free up a source going towards other community needs, which we've talked about, one's childcare, whatever. But, you know, it's always nice to see your sales tax rate go down because the needs have been taken care of. as appropriately from property tax. But that leads me to kind of thinking of our 0.45 cent existing City of Aspen childcare housing sales tax. And there's been a certain allocation made of that tax between housing and childcare. And perhaps we make a larger allocation of that tax to housing components for childcare as opposed to the general public. I would not want to start saying we're setting aside the rent money for one specific type of employment group or worker. But if it was a tax originally passed for housing and daycare, and to use more of that for housing daycare workers, that's the source I would go to. And I think that that wouldn't create that system of saying, are you prioritizing job types over just the fact that you're a worker in the community. And, you know, we also know that the RET has been performing extremely well in the past year and a half. Not saying it's going to go on forever, but I do think that that should be something that we look at of how we allocate that going forward and allocate more towards housing for daycare workers. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel.
Can I ask a clarifying question there? So it would be helpful to understand if the council would like us to evaluate means beyond the current Kids First Fund's revenue stream for daycare and early childhood education professional housing. Because our limiting factor by far is this fund in that type of use. And the trade-off that will, as we bring more about the Burlingame forward, our analysis of how big can that facility really be is more a function of how well that fund can sustain the financial aid needs of the programs and of the families more than it is about what is our ability to bear the capital cost. So I'm a little unclear if you want us to begin looking outside of the Kids First Fund as revenue options for child care related housing.
I would look at any other sources that are potential, but I do think we should look at what is the split currently going straight into general housing for the lottery from that 0.45 versus how much. And I know, look, at first it was 50-50 and that was 45-55 or more towards childcare. Maybe that ratio should change yet again, but specifically allocated towards housing. That's my interest. I don't know where everyone else is.
So I have a question, Rachel. There's 0.45, and it's, do we have the capability of changing how that's allocated?
Yes.
What's sunset on that?
It was extended quite a while ago, but I think 2040 maybe, or was it less than that? Because Pete has been telling us we're going to need to renew some of our taxes to go forward with lumberyard. But I thought they still extend for a good period of time now.
Well, I highly value childcare, but I really am reluctant to get into prioritizing who gets housing. I mean, we can't have childcare without housing for the childcare providers, but that's I mean, we've said this for decades, probably a slippery road to start.
Yeah, and I agree with you entirely, Ward. This is why I'm saying I would not look at the real estate transfer tax to be towards any specific type of occupation. But the housing daycare tax was passed specifically for those two purposes, and I believe the allocation percentages has been changed at the council table before to put more towards childcare. And perhaps there's an additional percentage that could be allocated in that direction for a period of time until we can solve a little more of this affordable housing solution
And
for childcare workers.
to back to what Sarah said, from what I heard, or what I thought I heard, was that that fund isn't going to be sufficient to support Kids First.
It's not that it's not sufficient, it's your limiting factor to the size of facility you'll be able to support at Burlingame or other places.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, I think you're absolutely right, Sarah, but without other partners perhaps helping in the childcare crisis, like the county or other entities who would like their workers to have children in a childcare facility. So you're right, if it's all on us, it's absolutely the only source. And, you know, I don't know, without doing some financial analysis with Pete, about what that would mean. Would a shift of an additional $50,000 a year towards Kids First allow them to be making the mortgage payments on X many units? I don't know, you know, and carry some housing. Would the shift need to be another $100,000 a year into the child care Kids First board towards housing purposes be enough for them to start to tackle this issue? But I don't have all those numbers in front of me, or to know how much would, again, you know, but it's a 0.45 cent, and we could look at how it's allocated. So my bigger point.
You mentioned partners, and so I think the Aspen School District, perhaps they could add some, you gotta find,
Wherever you
Most
can.
likely the other way around, just to clarify there, like we probably need to induce them to go to year-round care.
Yeah, no, but I'm just thinking, you know, however, but that's the source I would look at first, rather than quote a new tax to the public or something.
And those conversations are moving forward. That's one of the things that this consultant, in fact, we have a meeting next week, I believe Wednesday, where she is initially pulling that group together and clarifying roles and interests and all of that. So that's not off the table. My understanding is that, yes, I think it was almost 20 years ago that council changed that percentage.
A little bit more towards
yeah.
childcare.
Yeah, because, and you know, at that time, I think we all stressed that that wasn't something that anybody wanted to go through every couple of years, because whether it was staffing or financial aid to families, you had to know sort of what that budget was going to be moving forward. But, yeah, so I guess I'm asking the same question then. Are we looking at an analysis to determine what that additional cost would be to buy down or to finance some rental units, at least for?
We could handle that at the staff side. I feel like I
Okay.
have. I heard what I needed to hear. Councils, just so you're aware, you receive a recommendation from me in the budget each year of what that split should be between housing and childcare funds. And so that's certainly something in the budget process you have the authority to amend. It is a legislative function of the council. It does not require, the split does not require citizen vote.
and Sarah, the enticement or the encouragement of the Aspen School District may be that we could take over, or somebody else could take over administration and staffing in exchange for more capacity. Just
Sure, you could hear some really interesting debates between the three of us about why I don't want to directly employ childcare workers and professional early childhood education staff. The liability issues concern me greatly, just in our scope of services we offer. But I should stop because I'm not letting her present her side of the argument.
Well, I think there's a big range between, you know, giving them some guidance and some administrative support versus running it. And I actually made that pretty clear to the superintendent that we weren't looking to run their program.
I just needed some clarification. The split, I'm hearing two things. I'm hearing a split between childcare and housing, but then I'm also hearing preferential housing for childcare workers, and it's not clear to me which one we're talking about.
I believe the request on
Microphone.
I believe the request on the table is for us to look to affordable housing solutions for early childhood workforce. And I have suggested that the 0.45 cent housing daycare tax, which has an allocation between those causes at this table, could probably be used for housing daycare workers because it was part of a housing daycare tax. I don't want to start segregating off or prioritizing any employment type out of the larger funds that we have, whether it's mitigation or whether it's the RET.
So
But
the,
I would consider it for housing childcare workers.
got it. So of the existing funds that are coming in and being split, the part that's going to the housing part of that is already only for,
No, it's not.
not. So we are suggesting changing that dynamic.
Yes.
Okay, understood.
But, you know, I'll be clear, if we go back far enough, when I was mayor and we were building the Truscott addition, we were programmed to use those dollars to buy 11 rental units, buy down the subsidy, the full cost, so that we would have childcare workers in the future. And then when I lost my reelection as mayor, a future board took over and they decided that we didn't need to do that. But there were plans in the past that were approved by our legal department or whatever to be able to use those in tandem. Basically, what you're doing is okay, let me say, I don't know the exact split right now, but say if it was 50-50 between housing and childcare, you're now going to change it to 60-40, and the childcare gets the 60, and out of what childcare gets, they decide to use it for housing units. It's changing the split for specific purposes for that agency to accomplish those goals. It would still leave the remaining 40% going into the general housing fund for general lotteries.
Got it. Understood. Thank you for clarifying, so I
you.
understand. I'm not a hard no on that, but I am skeptical of any sort of housing that's specified for one group. So if we are looking at that, like I'm further to the no side, and so I'll need a lot of data and a lot of justification, but I'm not totally close to it.
Jordan,
I appreciate that it's like the clearest place to look, and so it makes sense.
Right.
And I think, as you heard from the city manager, staff will do the analysis, and I think what we're talking about in this case, although it may not be mutually exclusive, is potentially doing this at Burlingame, either part of or adjacent to that Burlingame facility. Right. And on the March, Jen Phelan will talk a little bit more about the complexities and the cost differentials in that.
Got it. Cool.
Thank you.
Additional input?
I'm completely supportive of everything presented. Really happy that we're moving so quickly on one of our 3 main council goals. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to just clarify for council, for those of you who've not seen this happen before, expedited approvals for Burlingame land use process. This is a step that is a delegated authority to the city manager that's used very rarely, but is essential for providing some priority for projects of critical community importance. And so this one would fit that category. The only other one of those that I've approved during my time here is the lumberyard, I think. Can you remember? I don't know.
Thanks. Great. Thank you.
You know, I have a lot of concerns about the unknowns. You know, as we move forward, I'm so concerned about the changing environment around childcare. I really appreciate, Shirley, that you characterized it when you looked at wait lists or what the potential need is that if you even cut it in half of what's reported or what we think we have as data, it's still an important need. And so I recognize that, but you know, this housing conversation that we're having right now is very important to me because I do have concern that there is a lot of efforts right now to increase capacities valley-wide, and I'm concerned that we won't have the staffing in our valley to fulfill these. So I have a lot of concerns moving forward. I spoke to Sarah about it today, and you know, we as a council, we've been talking about the Burlingame project that's coming to us pretty quickly here. And then also we've allocated space at the lumberyard. And again, my concerns on those are not necessarily on the need side from the user side, but really staffing is, I'm concerned that we, valley-wide, not just us, the city, but a lot of people are going to be putting efforts into this, and that their next series of challenges are going to be greater than even what these first rounds are, and the first rounds are about actually putting facilities in the ground. So I'm here engaged in this. I share the concerns about childcare in our community as we all do, but I also it's so murky as I look into my crystal ball going forward. I just have so many concerns. Nothing that takes me off of our goal at this time, but I just want to make sure that we're all conscientious of changing conditions.
It's a valid concern, you know, even for existing programs. I will give you that. And I think that's one of the reasons that we are working as hard as we are right now to help programs retain that staff and to look at ways to boost not only recruitment, but really the nurturing, whether that's the intern program or incubator business programs, things like that, that will really give people, because there are people that are interested. They need a reason to do this and to keep doing it and to live here. So I'm hopeful, but we've had some good conversations, certainly internally, but we've also had conversations, every time something about this topic hits the newspaper, we get people that call us immediately and want to be on the wait list for CMC or even for Burlingame. And it's like, we don't have a building yet. We don't have a program. It's a little early to be on that wait list. But we end up having a really good conversation. And just last week, I talked with a woman who is due to have a baby. I think she said May. And she works in marketing, and if there was anything she could do to help us, and I said, tell me again what your name is and how I can get a hold of you, because, you know, we're going to need everybody involved, and that's parents and community and everybody partnering. So she goes, you know, let me know when that RFP goes out, I'll help you. So
Thanks.
keep trying.
Thanks, Shirley.
Thank you.
Gracias.
All right.
All right, we have one more item this evening to talk about, Paepcke Transit Hub. So 60-second turnover time.
Yes. Yeah, he got a hold of me just today. Stop this.
Don't we have a settlement from the entitlements that capped the total
I don't know.
units that can be built from the entitlement process, so that,
It wasn't a settlement as a lawsuit, it was
a binding arbitration or something like that?
no, it wasn't even that, it was, when we developed it, we put in a maximum. So we had to go back to them, and their owners voted to increase the cap, but it set a cap.
Yeah.
Are you leaving us early?
Well, that's where we're at. There's
Never
some
do
legal
that.
instrument I knew that we can't just unilaterally say we're gonna build. Because while
45 seconds, I'm told. I'd like the wind.
All right.
We give up on a council ski day this year? We given up on a council ski day this year?
I just thought of that yesterday. It's kind of like, it'll be like a due Wednesday. I'll talk to you more.
It's fair. It's a fair concern.
I was like, how do you feel? And I was like, someday. It's like, oh God, I don't want to.
I got a half off, and we can.
We're just gonna
split
wait
our
for
task
construction
with it.
costs to go down.
There might be a solution.
Yeah.
I'll talk.
Kidding. They're not going down.
Yeah, that's funny. Let's just give her a couple seconds. She'll be walking in a moment.
Thanks for hanging out with us.
Good night, yeah.
There's some snacks downstairs as well for afterwards. Okay, cool. All right, this is our continuing meeting for February 28, 2022. Our last item on our agenda this evening is a Paepcke Transit Hub update and some new developments and some council directions needed here.
Good evening, Mr. Council, or Mr. Mayor and City Council.
Call him Mary
You
now.
can call me Mary.
Like the mayor said, we're here to talk about Paepcke Transit Hub and how that plays into the overall engineering 2022 capital budget. I'm Mike Horvath, I'm the project manager. I'm here with Pete Rice and Scott Miller. We also have Mark Gould, the CEO of Gould Construction, who is the proposed contractor for this project, online in case questions arise. Moving to the agenda, we'll talk about the current conditions in the construction market, project history, project budget, and steps forward, and then we'll have opening up to council for questions and a discussion. Staff is seeking council direction on how to proceed with the 2022 Paepcke Transit Hub project construction contracts totaling $4.4 million through project deferment and a spring supplemental. And with that, I'll pass it off to Scott to discuss the construction market.
Mr. Mayor and council members, I'm sure it's not breaking news that we have pretty severe cost inflation in not only in this valley, but in the region and in the country, and especially in the construction industry. That has hit home for us on this project and several others. We've had projects where we've had 1 or 2 bids. We've had projects where we've had no bids. So the discussion about labor costs is important, but if you can't get people to do the work, it doesn't matter. So we're facing that, especially on this project. When considering approval of 2021 carry forward, as well as 2023 new capital requests, staff is going to have to look at the list of all the projects and do some prioritization. And then when we come to you for a thumbs up or down, it's going to be a question of prioritizing. When council selected this project, they selected it for 3 main reasons. The safety of the traveling public, mobility improvements, and to promote higher bus ridership to reduce single occupancy vehicles on Highway 82 and in and about Aspen. So we'll start with the construction market, and I could probably give you 20 slides with all kinds of numbers, but we're not going to do that. The top part of this slide is from the Engineering News Record, which is a national service that tracks construction costs. So this just gives you a snapshot. I think this is year over year as of February.
Correct.
Is that right? So, and this is national, so this is very averaged out. But overall construction is up 8.4% for materials and labor costs. Vertical building costs are up 14.9%. Excuse me. Asphalt, just the material is up 19.3%. Concrete up 17.5%, material only. And then, as I said, skilled labor is actually only up 2.9%, but the biggest problem is there's a huge shortage of labor. I saw something today that just in the housing construction market, there's a shortage of about 500,000 workers. The little graph down below that's hard to read, the blue line shows a national average for